The House today passed the Stop School Violence Act in a 407 to 10 vote. That bill would spend $75 million on school safety grants to fund teacher and student safety training, create a coordinated national reporting system, and implement protocols developed by the FBI and Secret Service to prevent school shootings before they occur. Here's the debate on the bill before the vote. It's 45 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 4909, the Stop School Violence Act of 2018, as amended.
The clerk report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4909, a bill to reauthorize the grant program for school security in the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Goodlatte, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 4909 currently under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time as he wishes to use.
Today I rise in strong support of H.R. 4909, the Stop School Violence Act of 2018. Violence at our schools makes students feel vulnerable in a place where they should feel comfortable to learn, grow, and be happy. To curb violence at our nation's schools, the Stop School Violence Act provides a multi-layered approach to identify threats and prevent violence from taking place on school grounds. It provides much-needed resources to train students, teachers, and law enforcement officers on how to recognize and quickly respond to warning signs, and provides funding for technology to keep schools safe. 80% of school shooters told someone of their violent plans or exhibited warning signs. The bill before us today will ensure that students, teachers, and law enforcement will learn how to identify at-risk behaviors, properly assess threats, and intervene appropriately before a tragedy strikes. The Stop School Violence Act provides funding for training to prevent student violence against others and self, including training for local law enforcement officers, school personnel, and students. Prevention training gives students and school personnel the ability to recognize and respond quickly to warning signs of school violence and includes active shooter training. The bill provides funding for technology and equipment to improve school security and prevent attacks. This includes the development and operation of anonymous reporting systems, such as mobile apps, a hotline, and a website. Funding may also be used for metal detectors, locks, lighting, and other technologies to keep schools safe. The bill also supports the acquisition and installation of technology for expedited notification of local law enforcement during an emergency. The legislation also contains funding for school threat assessment and crisis intervention teams so that school personnel can respond to threats before they materialize. Finally, the Stop School Violence Act provides funding to support law enforcement coordination efforts, and in particular, those officers who already staff schools. The version of the bill before us today is the result of a collaborative effort of many of my colleagues who worked with Mr. Rutherford to incorporate many of their ideas. I'd like to point out the important contributions of Representatives Susan Brooks, Kaufman, Chabot, Granger, Davis, Messer, and Bost, including many key elements of legislation that they have introduced into this bill that have made the bill stronger. Finally, I want to thank Mr. Rutherford and the bipartisan group of co-sponsors for their work on this important bill, and I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 4909. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. What purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 4909, the Stop School Violence Act, as amended. But I do so with serious concerns about some of its provisions and mostly about what the bill fails to do. H.R. 4909 would authorize $50 million annually for grants administered by the Department of Justice to fund various training and other initiatives intended to enhance school safety. And it would authorize another $25 million annually to be used for other related purposes, including physical improvements such as metal detectors, better locks, and systems for schools to notify law enforcement of emergencies. The bill is fine as far as it goes, and we should certainly do more to make our schools safer, but it is shameful that we must do so because of our failure to reduce the threat of gun violence to children. It should be unacceptable to all of us that we must take steps to train staff and students to protect themselves against these types of incidents instead of spending more money on actually educating our young people. This bill does not include any provisions to strengthen our gun laws or to help keep guns out of the hands of those who should not possess them. Evidence and experience tell us that we must establish universal background checks instead of the flawed system we now have. We should encourage states to adopt laws providing for extreme risk protection orders, and we must ban assault weapons and high-capacity ammunition magazines. These steps would help prevent not only school shootings, but would reduce the daily toll of gun violence in our communities. None of these critical provisions are included in this bill, which was never examined by the Judiciary Committee, either through a hearing or a legislative markup session. Had we taken these steps, which we could have done quickly in the exactly 1 month since the tragic Parkland, Florida shooting, we might have produced a much better bill for floor consideration. The suspension version of the bill does include an explicit prohibition against the funds being used on firearms or firearms training. Because President Trump and others in the administration have indicated that they believe arming teachers is part of the solution to this problem, it was important to my colleagues and to me that we be assured that this program, at least, will not be used for such a purpose, which would actually endanger students, not make them safer. However, we should have addressed serious concerns that have come to our attention with respect to the anonymous tip reporting systems and threat assessment and intervention teams that would be funded by this bill. We want people to report information about someone who may present a danger to students, but the bill does not include requirements that these systems provide adequate due process protections for students against whom a report is made. I have long-standing concerns about the increased use of law enforcement in schools. History tells us that without proper training, use of such policies can have a disproportionate impact on students of color and students with disabilities. In the decades since Columbine, when the nation rushed to increase school-based law enforcement efforts, thousands of vulnerable students have entered the school-to-prison pipeline for conduct that should be treated as routine behavior violations. I fear, therefore, that efforts to increase school-based law enforcement without guardrails to ensure it is done well and based on strong evidence may repeat the risks of the past. My concern is only heightened by the Trump administration's ongoing efforts to remove important tools to ensure states and school districts understand their civil rights obligations when disciplining students. I urge Secretary DeVos and Attorney General Sessions to maintain current discipline and school resource officer guidance to ensure implementation of this bill does not exacerbate the school-to-prison pipeline. We should have had the opportunity to address these important issues through consideration in committee, but we did not. Like the sponsors of this bill, I want Congress to do more to make our schools safer. Therefore, I will support this bill today, notwithstanding the serious concerns I've outlined, with the hope that we will address these concerns going forward. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Rutherford, a member of the Judiciary Committee and the chief sponsor of this legislation.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, today the House of Representatives has a chance to take an important first step towards keeping our students and our teachers safe by passing the Stop School Violence Act. This bill is the result of bipartisan work of Representative Hal Rogers, Representative Ted Deutsch, and also Representative Kilmer. We also incorporated, as we mentioned earlier, excellent ideas and key elements from legislation by Chairwoman Granger, Representative Susan Brooks, Representative Shabbat, Rodney Davis, Messer, and Bost. And I want to thank all of them for their work and commitment to this very important issue. I'd also like to recognize in a very special way the dedication and passion of the parents and members of Sandy Hook Promise who have been integral to us moving this bill forward. I really cannot say enough about that organization. As a career law enforcement officer and sheriff for 12 years in my hometown of Jacksonville, Florida, I know firsthand the importance of communities working together to spot early warning signs of violence. And this is why this bill invests in early intervention and prevention programs in our local schools, so that our communities and law enforcement can be partners in preventing these horrific acts from occurring. We need to give students, teachers, and law enforcement the tools and training they need to identify warning signs and to know who to contact and provide them an anonymous tip source to provide that information. Now, I should point out here that those receiving the tips, the agencies that are charged with providing due process are the ones who should provide due process here, not the tipster, not the child who may be calling in to talk about an issue that he thinks is important to law enforcement. That's their responsibility to provide due process to the individuals involved. This bill also gives funding for physical enhancements to harden the target on our school campuses. And I know from my law enforcement experience that security does require a multi-layered approach. Our bill supports one very important layer of security for our schools. There's still much more work to be done, but the best way to keep our students and teachers safe is to give them the tools and the training to recognize those warning signs to prevent violence from ever entering our school grounds. This bill aims to do just that, Mr. Speaker. And as I used to tell my community in Northeast Florida when I was sheriff, I do not want to be the best first responder to an active shooter event. I want to prevent that occurrence before it happens. And that is the goal of the Stop School Violence Act. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Virginia reserves his time, and the gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of H.R. 4909, the Stop School Violence Act. We have a fundamental responsibility to protect our young people from violence, and this package of school security improvements is an important step. In particular, this bill includes a bipartisan provision that I introduced with my friend and colleague from Illinois, Congressman Mike Bost, to help schools acquire and install panic buttons in classrooms for the use in emergency situations. Mr. Bost and I first introduced the Securing Our Schools Act in January, and I am proud of the support we built from both sides of the aisle, which helped get this provision included in today's school safety package. The technology will ensure students and teachers have a more immediate method of notifying law enforcement and first responders in case of a medical emergency, an active school shooter incident, or a natural disaster. All congressional offices have similar emergency buttons. If this technology is good enough for members of Congress, we should be doing the same to keep our young people safe where they learn. While this bill represents progress, it is far from an adequate solution to the threat of gun violence. We now need to build on this bipartisan momentum for other urgent solutions to improve gun safety and reduce gun violence. This includes universal background checks, restrictions on the sale of bump stocks, assault weapons, and high-capacity magazines, and research into the causes of gun violence. Here in this Congress, we have the ability to save lives with common sense legislation. We must act, and I urge my colleagues to support this legislation as a good start. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time, and the gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Rogers, a co-sponsor of this legislation and former chairman of the House Appropriations Committee.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman for yielding me this time. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of the Stop School Violence Act. And I want to congratulate Sheriff Rutherford, the original sponsor of the bill, for his dedicated work on this project, among others. In the immediate wake of last month's tragedy in Parkland, More than 15 students in my home district in eastern Kentucky were arrested. Thankfully, our students and local law enforcement acted swiftly to prevent a copycat event in our own schools. As our nation battles this epidemic of school violence, it is imperative that we utilize our available resources to stop tragic events before they occur. But unfortunately, too many students and officials don't have the tools they need to successfully act under similar situations. This bill takes necessary and common sense steps to prevent school bullying, suicide, and violence, providing grant funding to states to implement proven and evidence-based trainings that detect threats before they come to fruition. In most cases of school suicides and shootings, at least one other person knew of the plan and failed to report it. So these appalling events are avoidable. But we must give our schools the tools and resources they need, and this bill would do just that. Enhancing early detection, prevention, and coordination with law enforcement will save lives. There may not be one single answer to preventing all future violence in schools, but this effort is very much a part of the solution. So, Mr. Speaker, I was proud to join my colleagues in introducing this bipartisan legislation, and I urge my colleagues to vote for it. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Virginia reserves his time. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. Esty.
Gentlelady from Connecticut is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the Stop School Violence Act. Mark Barton and Nicole Hockley each had a child killed in a first-grade classroom at the Sandy Hook Elementary School in the district where I live 5 years ago. They and other parents took their grief and formed a group called the Sandy Hook Promise, and that group has been working tirelessly for over 5 years now, and the bill we address here today is largely a testament to the hard work that they have put in, working with mental health professionals, school officials, and law enforcement to come up with real steps that will help to save lives. The Stop School Violence Act will not save every life threatened by gun violence, but it will save some, and we need to do what we can. But let me be very clear. This needs to be the first step of many steps we can and should be taking in this House to address the scourge of gun violence. We have enormous support for bipartisan comprehensive background checks, for Fix NICS bill, for banning of bump stocks. This needs to be the first of a long line of steps that this Congress owes to the American people, owes to the students gathered on the lawn of the Capitol today and in every classroom throughout America. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from New York reserves his time. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat, a member of the Judiciary Committee, chairman of the Small Business Committee.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, Majority Leader McCarthy, and Congressman Rutherford for your leadership on this important legislation. Over the years, our nation's schools have become soft targets for any would-be killer who's gotten access to a gun. We need to do a better job of protecting both students and faculty from these increasingly frequent threats. This legislation combines school safety provisions included in 2 bills, one originally introduced by Mr. Rutherford and the other by me. Together, this proposal represents a collection of common sense solutions to better help protect our students, our teachers, and other faculty at our schools. H.R. 4909 reauthorizes the COPS Secure Our Schools grant program and more than doubles its annual budget from $30 million to $75 million annually. Of that $75 million, not less than $50 million per year will be made available for evidence-based strategies and programs to prevent violence in public or private schools over the next decade. Among the security measures for which these grants may be used include additional training to ensure the health and well-being of students, the the development of more robust threat reporting systems, and investments in more advanced security technologies. Additionally, the COPS Secure Our Schools grants can be used in conjunction with a COPS hiring program to ensure that our schools have both the security measures and personnel in place to prevent future violence. On Monday, U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced that the Department of Justice will use the COPS hiring program to increase the number of school resource officers nationwide. The legislation we are considering today could help that effort by allowing schools to hire retired police officers to provide security if the Department of Justice determines that such plans would provide a significant improvement in school security. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Dan Hills, President of Cincinnati FOP, for actively engaging on this issue of school safety and for bringing these types of forward-thinking solutions to my attention. He has been a tremendous resource throughout this process. I urge my colleagues to support this measure, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Ohio yields back his time, and the gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, a sponsor of this legislation, Mr. Deitch.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you. I thank my friend from New York. Mr. Speaker, the trauma that my community in Parkland, Florida experienced was not unique. Gun violence tears apart American communities on a daily basis. So know what happened on February 14th when 14 students and 3 teachers were hunted in their schools with an AR-15 assault rifle by a former student. That wasn't unique. But the problem of gun violence in America is a uniquely American problem. It's an epidemic. It's a complex problem. There are many facets. But we know what we need to do, and I am committed to taking any step to getting any new policy across the finish line that will make our kids safer. This bill, the Stop School Violence Act, is a good bill. It will not solve our gun problem. It won't ban bump stocks or require Americans be 21 to buy a gun, or fix our broken background check system, or get weapons of war, the weapons of choice for mass shooters, off our streets and out of our communities. But it will help troubled students that need help get help, and it will help teachers and law enforcement identify potential threats before it's too late. Before we vote, I'd like to make a few things clear. First, this isn't a response to the tragedy at Marjory Stoneman Douglas. In fact, Congressman Rutherford and I introduced this bill a week before the shooting. The programs in this bill are based on rigorous evidence-based evaluation. They are proven to help reduce isolation and identify kids who need help. We had no idea at the time that we wouldn't be able to move fast enough to stop this tragedy. We had no idea that we would have an urgent need to help get more American schools access to these programs. But since Congress has failed the American people by ignoring the deadly scourge of gun violence, since we failed the families of Stoneman Douglas, just like we failed the families of Sandy Hook and Columbine and so many others, we owe it to students and teachers across this country to at least give them tools to help identify dangerous behavior. The failure of Congress to take action in response to gun violence has left the American gun violence debate in a ridiculous place. Armed teachers in every hallway? Is that what we want education to be in America? No. I'm glad this bill includes a specific prohibition against the use of grant dollars to arm school personnel, including teachers, or to train school personnel to use firearms. Since Congress has failed the American people by ignoring this scourge of gun violence, failed the families of Stoneman Douglas, the failure of Congress to take action has left the American gun violence, has left us in this position of debating gun violence where we're hesitant to even take small steps. This is a small and important step. I've heard civil rights concerns related to racial profiling and discrimination associated with threat assessments and anonymous reporting, and I am sensitive to those. Congress should never be in a position to make the serious problem worse with new programs to expand the discrimination already entrenched in our school system and society as a whole. And I know the evidence that shows that discriminatory discipline in schools can have dramatic long-term effects on academic performance and wide-ranging impacts. But this bill, Mr. Speaker, does not perpetuate discriminatory policies. Zero tolerance and other questionable discipline policies are not evidence-based, and as such would not be considered a proper use of grant funds. Stop School Violence Program grants are not intended to be used to discipline students. Instead, threat assessment and intervention protects potential victims and addresses the underlying problems to make schools safe for everyone. Finally, Studies on evidence-based school threat assessment and intervention practices have shown that these programs actually decrease racial profiling, bullying, suicides, and suspensions. I am proud of the bipartisan work that has gone into this bill. And once we have taken this step, this astonishingly modest yet important first step, we must finally do our jobs and work together to make meaningful changes towards stopping the epidemic of gun violence in this country. I know that this does not go far enough in terms of what we need to do. I understand that. I believe it deeply. But it is an important step, a bipartisan step that we should take today. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York reserves his time. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this year, I joined my colleagues from the Kentucky delegation here on the House floor to lead a moment of silence for the victims of a tragic school shooting at Marshall County High School in my district in Kentucky on January 23rd. Today, I am proud to rise in support of the Stop School Violence Act, which I believe will be a critical step forward in preventing future school shootings like the tragedies we witnessed in Marshall County, Kentucky, and of course, at Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. In the wake of the Marshall County shooting, I heard from the families of victims and other members of the community that their top priority was enhancing physical security in our schools, whether that means installing metal detectors, hiring school resource officers, or making other evidence-based improvements to prevent and mitigate school violence. This bill will provide resources to schools so that they can do just that, while also supporting training for students, teachers, and local law enforcement to identify and prevent violence in our schools. The Marshall County community is resilient as we continue to mourn the loss of 2 young lives in our community, along with those in Parkland. We will also fight to protect our students, educators, and communities. I believe the Stop School Violence Act will help defend our schools from those who wish to inflict harm on others, and I urge my colleagues to support this important and bipartisan bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time, and the gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'll reserve.
Reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Speaker, may I inquire how much time is remaining on each side?
The gentleman from Virginia has 8 minutes remaining. The gentleman from New York has 9 minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Bost.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 4909, the Stop School Violence Act, which includes my bipartisan legislation to increase access to emergency panic buttons in the classroom. I want to thank Mr. Rutherford for his bill before us today, and my friend from Illinois, Mr. Snyder, for partnering with me on the school safety language we had included in this bill. As a father and a grandfather, I know firsthand how important it is that our nation's children have a safe environment to grow and learn. As a former first responder, I know that response time is vitally important during any emergency situation. This bill makes it much easier for schools to increase their security and provide life-saving technology to contact first responders immediately when violence or any other emergency occurs. We already have panic buttons to protect our investment at our banks. Well, there's no greater investment in the country than our children. We should be doing the best to protect them too. And this legislation is a step in the right direction. I urge all of my colleagues to support this legislation, and with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Virginia reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 4 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, the ranking member on the Crime Subcommittee, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank the distinguished ranking member. I thank the chairman of the committee, and to the proponents of this bill. I acknowledge their commitment and certainly their sincerity. Speaker, I join thousands of young people today on the west side of the Capitol as they came from schools throughout this region to stand for 17 minutes to acknowledge those who lost their life in Florida, in a Florida high school, of which that should not have been their destiny. It should not have been their destiny to die in a massacre, a bloody massacre in their school, nor should it have been the destiny of those in the Pulse nightclub, or Sutherland Springs, or Columbine, or Las Vegas, or Texas Tech, or any other place, the streets of Houston, in my district, in Chicago. This bill is not about preventing the unsafe use of guns. Guns kill. And the young people today made it very clear that they will not stop until we have real gun safety legislation, barring of the AR-15 universal background checks. But at the same time, I believe these bills of our colleagues are important legislative initiatives. And so in tribute to these individuals who have passed, but also the members, I believe the Stop School Violence Act of 2017 is a ready response to aspects of school safety and security that are very important. One of the unique aspects of this bill that I think should be noted is the language in the bill itself that indicates through evidence-based strategies and programs to prevent violence, which may include the use of appropriate technologies. The bill readily acknowledges many aspects of school safety, and I think this will certainly give to our school boards and our teachers, of which the AFT is one of the supporters of this legislation, and the National School Board Association. But it does not answer the question totally of the parent who said, I didn't get a chance that morning to say goodbye to my daughter. We must address the question of gun violence. And I believe it is important that we send a stop to children evacuating schools like this one and be able to address real, nonpartisan, bipartisan response to the proliferation of guns, whether it means enforcing gun laws, lifting the age to 21, banning bump stocks, all of the points that we thought the president was supporting, but unfortunately he is not. I do want to raise the point of the tip line. I think it is extremely important, as long as it's guided by teachers and counselors and mental health experts. But we must be very sure that we do not have the racial disparities where the largest percentage of individuals impacted by the tip line may be African American youth, Hispanic youth, Muslim youth. We know that racial disparities are real because the largest percentage of those who are sent to detention or sent to juvenile happen to be African American children, young boys and girls, which I really believe is something that has to stop. In addition, it is important that we comply with civil rights laws. And I think the advocates of civil rights organizations like the Legal Defense Fund are absolutely right. There must be a standard where the civil rights of these children are not violated according to this tip line, and that due process is provided by them. We must make a statement here today that as we support this legislation, we do not intend to support legislation that will be skewed to be biased toward these young people. These young people in impoverished neighborhoods and schools, Mr. Speaker, deserve to learn as well. But we want safe schools, and those safe schools can be done with the beginning of this infrastructure.
Lady, an additional 30 seconds.
The gentlelady is recognized for 30 seconds.
I thank the gentleman. We can begin with this infrastructure. We can begin with this question of school safety and a tip line and best evidence and best practices. We can begin with grants to ensure the safety of our schools. We can allow schools to make choices about what will make them more safe. At the same time, we must safeguard our children and their rights, and we must answer the cry of the children, and that is we will not finish our task until we have real gun safety legislation. Enough is enough. It's time to act now. I need my Republican brothers and sisters to work with me. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you to my colleague, Chairman Goodlatte, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know I'm not supposed to be able to recognize people in the gallery because it's a breach of the House rules, so I won't mention to the viewers that there are a lot of students in the gallery today seeing the political process at work. This is an opportunity for everyone to get to understand what it means to affect public policy in this great country. And we are glad and we want to hear more from students throughout this nation about what you think our government can do to make this country better. I just want to come here to talk about today being exactly a month since a parent's worst nightmare came true for many in Parkland, Florida. The school they send their kids to was attacked. This issue is personal for me as a parent and also as somebody who's experienced gun violence on a baseball field less than a year ago. I think about the same fear, the same smells, sounds, and now the same healing process that those survivors will be going through. But I can only imagine how processing those things as a teenager feels for them, or the pain that their parents, especially those who lost a child that day, are feeling right now. I believe the only reason all of us on that baseball field are still here today is because we had someone there who was protecting us and firing back. And boy, did David Bailey and Crystal Griner and the Alexandria Police fire back. That doesn't mean I believe all schools need the same kind of security measures, but I do believe all of our schools need to look closely at their security protocols and policies, and Congress should help them make the changes that they deem necessary. There wasn't just one failure on February 14th, and as such, there can't be just one solution. This bill is one part of addressing this issue, and it's something we can and should do right now. This week, Mr. Chairman.
Expired.
30 seconds.
I'm pleased to yield additional 30 seconds to the gentleman.
Gentleman is recognized for 30 seconds.
This week I met with Central A&M High School in my district to discuss school safety and what they need to make schools more secure. Following the tragedy at Parkland, they sent a letter to parents and students, and it had a line that stood out to me. Safety is everybody's responsibility. They're right. Let's pass the Stop School Violence Act. It's only part of the solution, and there are other issues that we still need to address. But if you believe in helping our schools become safer, then you should vote for this bipartisan bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. Members are advised not to refer to people in the gallery under the House rules. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Yeah, I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Texas.
Gentlelady from Texas recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman. In the course of my coming over to the floor, we heard a comment of which I intend to check, of an accidental shooting of a student by a teacher that the gun went off. I just want to conclude by saying that we have brought people together in that nothing in this bill will allow for the federal funds to be used in these grants for the arming of teachers. And I think the Teachers Association has evidenced their support for that, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, we have just one speaker remaining, and we're prepared to close, so we reserve.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Prepared to close.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself the balance of my time.
Gentleman is recognized for the remainder of his time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, young people across the country are taking a stand and calling upon this Congress to do something about the scourge of gun violence that has terrorized our schools and our streets for too long. This bill fails to do so, and it cannot be our only response to these demands. We must make schools safer, but the best way to do that is to do more to prevent gun violence from occurring in the first place. Congress must do more to stop gun violence. Congress should pass an assault weapons ban. Congress should pass an effective background check. Congress should ban high-capacity magazines. Congress should do a lot more. It is not enough to say that staff and students must do more to protect themselves. Mr. Speaker, it is time to take decisive action to stop gun violence in our communities. You are faced with a simple choice, Mr. Speaker. Will you stand with these young people who are demanding action, or will you stand with the NRA and be complicit in the continuing violence in our schools?
Hi everybody, just a quick reminder, Mox News survives solely on your tips and contributions. It's easy to make a contribution or a tip or leave a tip at moxnews.com, or there are clickable links in the text body of this video. It should take the average person, most people, probably less than 2 minutes. Thanks very much for your time and your continued support. Stay cool, Wednesdays. This war is going to end. Till that day.